One of the major reasons why we're going to use the group policy in our environment, whether it be an enterprise level environment with thousands of computers and thousands of users, or in a small to medium-sized organization with maybe only dozens of computers and dozens of users and anywhere in between, is the ability of group policies and group policy objects to implement a secure environment or implement security within inside our organization. So what we're going to be looking at in this session is the group policy security interface. We're going to explore some of those settings that are available to us through group policy. Then we'll finish up looking at the ability to prevent users or allow users to run specific applications inside the environment with software restriction policies, or SRP, versus AppLocker. And we're going to contrast what the two different mechanisms are and which ones would be appropriate for our environment. So with that said, right, the security settings. Security settings can be configured both under the user and the computer component of group policy. If you bring up a group policy interface, and we're just going to, this is really the only slide I have on it, but what we're going to talk about really is we could spend hours going through every one of these line items. So the things we're going to look at mainly going through here is, we'll look at, first of all, the account policies and the event logs and local policies. We'll look at restricted groups and system services. We'll come down and look at the Windows Advanced Firewall. And then we'll look at, finally, the software restriction policies and the application control policies, which is where AppLocker is found. The other line items will be covered throughout other videos and other classes, but we're going to focus on just those few areas here. Again, right, we could be here for days if we wanted to go through every single line item in great detail. So, to launch the Group Policy Management Console, again, I can launch it one in multiple ways. If I have it on my tiles, I can list it from the tile. I can launch it from administrative tools, or I can just type Group Policy. And I think that's one of my favorite features that Microsoft actually introduced back in Vista and Server 2008 was the ability to go to the Smart Search and start typing and just have it shrink down. And that continues on now from the desktop in Server 2012 and Windows 8. So we'll launch the Group Policy Management Console. And what I'm going to do is start up, and I don't want to mess around with the default domain policy or the default domain controller policy, just in case I make a setting that I don't want it to affect the entire environment. So I'm just going to come down here to one of these group policies that we've been playing with off and on. And I'm going to use this new group policy object that's not linked anywhere and click Edit. So this actually brings up the Group Policy Management Console in the interface. And if I expand policies under the computer, expand Windows settings, and expand security settings, we'll see we have security settings under the computer component. And if I come down under the user component, policies, Windows settings, security settings, we also have a couple of the line items down under the user. They, in essence, will do the exact same thing they do under the computer component, but instead of being focused at the computer level, they'll be focused at the user level. So with that said, all right, let's just jump right into some wonderful security settings here. Some of the things we can actually do is under account policy. I'm going to expand this out, and we can set three things here. We can set our user password preferences, whether it be number of characters, whether or not it's complex, how long it's going to be good for, how often they can change it, where we set out our lockout policy and our Kerberos policy. Folks, right, even though I can configure this in a group policy object and link this object at an OU level, these settings will not take effect on any domain-based user account. These settings will only affect local users and local user accounts on any computer in that OU. It will not affect domain-based accounts. Domain-based password policy can only be set at the domain level. But if I come in under the password policy, right, again, you can see this is where I can enforce history, password age, password length, complexity, just to review a complexity. There are 4 things that make up complexity: uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and numbers. You must have 3 of those 4 things in order to be considered a complex password. We have our lockout policy. Microsoft by default does not set a lockout policy. When we set a lockout policy, we put in a lockout threshold. How many attempts are we going to give the user with an invalid password before we lock them out? In this case, I'll choose 3, and I'll hit OK. And then it's going to recommend that we configure the lockout duration and the lockout password counter reset. They're both set to 30 minutes. One thing I want to show you is my account lockout counter, which is how long before we reset that count of 3 back to 0. This value has to be equal to or less than your actual lockout duration. You can't make the counter reset longer than the actual lockout duration itself. If you set this value lockout duration to 0, right, the users will stay locked out until an administrator unlocks them. Under our Kerberos keys, right, this is how long our Kerberos session tickets are good for. How often a user must renew the tickets. This is also where we set our Kerberos clock synchronization, how long the SKU can be before we're considered out of sync. And Microsoft's default is 5 minutes on clock synchronization. So if a client computer's clock gets off by more than 5 minutes of the domain controllers, those client computers will not authenticate. So those are the things under account policies. If I come down to local policies, right, there's an entire gamut of information down here. First of all, okay, if I want to audit anything inside the environment, auditing has to be turned on. I either have to turn it on at the domain level if I want to audit things like Active Directory access or querying of Active Directory or policy changes in Active Directory or account log on and log off information in Active Directory. I have to enable auditing at the domain level. If I want to audit file and folder access out of the machine, or I want to audit printer access at the machine, or I want to audit log on and log offs at the machine, I have to enable auditing at a minimum of the local policy on the machine. Or I can enable it at the domain level or at an OU level and have it filtered out. So if I expand my audit policy here, you'll see that we can audit multiple things. And when we audit, we have a choice of auditing both successes and failures. Now let's think about this for just a second. If I only audit successes, right, and if that's all I audit, will I ever see a failed attempt to do something, whether it be a logon attempt, an access to Active Directory, or accessing a file, or accessing a printer? Right? If all I do is audit successes, will I ever see the failure? No, you won't. So as a result, right, you'll never know if someone's trying to hack. Let's think about that. What if I only audit failures? Will I ever see the successful attempt of the hacker to get in? So we see all these unsuccessful attempts, right? Then all of a sudden, the unsuccessful attempts stop. Did the hacker give up? Or did they get in? And if you're not auditing successes, you'll never know that they actually got in. So when you're going to audit, you should audit both successes and failures. Coming down through here, a couple things I want to point out. The top 3 line items are all auditing things with inside Active Directory. And they kind of let you know what they are. All the bottom ones are going to be audited on the local machines out within inside the organization, which also could be on a domain controller. All this stuff is going to be stored in the security log out at the individual machines. So these events would be stored in the security log of the domain controller where the event occurred. In order to view the security log, you must be a member of the local administrators group. This line item here would log at the local machine a person logged on. It would store at the local machine a person logged off, whether it be domain credentials or local credentials. This one here would be stored at the domain controller, that a user logged on using their domain account and they logged off using the domain account. Going on down, right? Object access. That one is doing things like file and folder and printer access, where they success or succeeded. Process tracking is if you're going to audit and you want to keep tabs on applications launching or applications closing. So again, all this information is going to be stored inside of the security log out at the local machine. If I come down to user right assignments, there's a wealth of information in here. And again, right, we could be in here for a couple days if I attempted to cover every single line item. So some of the major line items. The top one here. This one and where's it at? Deny access from the computer from network. Let's say this computer is a sensitive machine. And let's say it belongs to HR. And I only want personnel from HR to log onto the machine. I can actually set this up one of two ways. I could set this up as access this computer from the network and only put the HR department group to allow them to log on or access this machine from the network. What will happen is I will now have a implicit deny. If you're not a member of the group that's been given permissions to access, right, you won't be able to access it. Down here, if I do an explicit deny, that means you get an implicit allow. So it's either or. Up here, I do the implicit deny. Down here, it'd be an implicit allow. I also have the ability, I'm going to get these deleted out of the way. I also have the ability to allow logon locally, and the ability to deny logon locally. Okay. The logon locally and deny logon locally is exactly what they say. If I create a group that says, come on, allow logon locally, and I only put the HR department in there, if anyone other than someone in HR attempts to log in that machine locally, they'll be given an access denied. So to be created an implicit deny list. If I come down here, that creates an explicit deny list. So if you're in a member of a group, no matter what other group you might be a member of, you won't be allowed to log onto the machine. So those are the two biggies that we see a lot of organizations using, especially on sensitive machines. Going on down, add a workstation to the domain. By default, any authenticated user can join up to 10 computers to the domain. Which means if I want to have a delegated OU administrator joining computers to the domain, when they get to 10, they're not going to be able to join computers anymore. So if I wanted to be able to allow them to continue to join machines to the domain, I would add them to this group, give them this option at this OU level or at the domain level, and now they can join more than 10 computers to the domain. A couple of the other biggies. And let me scroll up here just a little bit so I can get both of them on the screen at the same time. It may not both fit. Oh, they're both not going to fit. Backup directories. And then if I scroll down, come on, scroll. And if I scroll down, restore files and directories. If you're the member of the backup operators group, you can back up and restore files that you normally would not have permissions to. In a sensitive environment where I have sensitive documents or maybe documents that could be used for corporate espionage or that type of stuff, Microsoft used to recommend, and they still do today, that the group of people you have backing up files should not be the same group of people that are restoring files. So that's how I can separate, put everybody in the backup operators group, and then this is where I can separate who can back up and who can restore. Going on back up, a couple of the other ones up here toward the top. By default, any user or any authenticated user now can change system time, but only members of the local administrators group can change the actual system time. So any user can change time zone. Right? Any user can change time zone. Going on down. If I have an OU, and I have someone in that OU is going to be responsible for installing and uninstalling device drivers, and they're not going to be a member of the local administrators group, I have an option right here for load and unload device drivers. This now gives the users in that environment the ability to install and uninstall device drivers, even though they may not be members of the local administrators groups on machines. The next one down is right here. By default, you must be a member of the local administrators group if you want to be able to view the security logs on a machine. If I want to give someone other than someone that's a member of the local administrators group the ability to view security logs, this is where I can go in and give them permissions of any user in here. And then last but not least, right here, shutting down the system. By default, on a non-server computer, in other words, a workstation machine, any user has the ability to shut the machines down. But if they log onto a server, by default, only administrators can shut them down. And that's where that line item was actually configured at on a server in the local policy of the machine. So those are the major line items under user rights. Under security options, one of the things that Microsoft did in Windows XP Service Pack 2 is they removed the ability for you to share something with a user that has a blank password. They also removed the ability for a user to remote desktop to a computer with a blank password. It requires you to have a password for all situations other than logging on locally. You can still log onto the box locally with a blank password. All of that is configured under this line item right here. Limit local account use to blank passwords. If I actually come in and look at that one, right? If I define that, notice it's enabled by default. If I disable it, users can now connect to this box with blank passwords, whether it be connecting to a network share, connecting to a printer, or attempting to connect to this machine with a remote desktop session. I can globally rename both the administrator and guest accounts. I can also globally either enable or disable the administrator and guest accounts. Going on down, right, a couple of these I think are kind of interesting. Allow undocking without having to log on. Is that really going to stop them from undocking? No. What that's going to do is it's going to prevent them from clicking the undock button on the desktop. They can still hit the eject button on the docking station. Just be aware of that. I can prevent them from installing printers, which will prevent installing network printers. I can go in and restrict access to the CD-ROMs and the floppy drives except to locally logged on users. So if I've shared the CD-ROM or I've shared a floppy drive, which don't know why you'd ever share a floppy, but you could, this would prevent those users from actually being able to connect to them remotely. A couple of the other ones down here. On a server, right? On a server, you may choose to, and in some organizations, I know here in our organization, we don't display the last logged on username. So when you log off, it actually, when you go to log in, it forces you to type your username. That's where we do it. Microsoft does not recommend that you disable the do not require Control-Alt-Delete. If you remember back quite a few years ago, there used to be a virus out there that had a splash screen that looked like the Control-Alt-Delete screen or the logon screen. So when you typed your user ID and password in, it actually captured your user ID and password. So if you hit Control-Alt-Delete, it would basically end that, or it'd bring up the 132 security dialog box. So you knew that the user was logged in or the computer was logged in. I also have the ability, scrolling on down, this one's kind of interesting. These two right here work together. I'm sure everyone has seen this before. When you sit down on a machine and there's you hit Control-Delete and a box pops up and says, this is the corporate computer. Be aware, Big Brother's always watching you. If you have problems, blah, 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 blah. Right? if I come in here and I configure this with the text, right, this is where I can type the text. Now, it doesn't look pretty. There's no way to format it. You can't bold or underline or any of that stuff. But this is where we type in the message text. Right? Remember, remember, Big Brother's watching you. Do not do anything we do not want you to do. And then finally, for trouble, (1) 800 who cares? Okay. And then you hit OK. You would think that box would now show up for everybody. Well, you thought wrong. The box will not show up if you do not give the message box a title. It can be a blank title, but you have to have a title. So I can do box title. Hit OK. Now the box will actually show up. So you now get the message box and the box title. So those two have to be set together. If you do not set them together, right, they won't work. So if I do a box without a title, box doesn't show up. If I do a title without a box, the box doesn't show up. Scrolling on down. Everybody's favorite. Everybody's favorite. Let me get down here. Right here. In Windows XP Service Pack 2, Microsoft removed the anonymous user out of the Everyone group, which means now in order for a user to access a resource that's been shared, right, the user must have either a user ID and password in your domain environment, or it must have a user and ID from a trusted environment. Which means if I log on with my local credentials to go to access that network resource, even though it may be shared with everyone, I won't be able to access it because I'm accessing it as the anonymous user. What this line item does here, if I double click on it, notice it says network access, let everyone's permission apply to the anonymous user. If I enable this, I've just added the anonymous user back to the Everyone group. So now if I share something with everyone, the anonymous user now gains access. If you looked at the exact same line items in Windows XP when they first changed it, this used to say something along the lines of, let the everyone permissions enumerate to the anonymous user. Which people are like, enumerate? What do you mean by that? So they actually changed it up, made it a little bit more user-friendly with, simply put, the anonymous user will now be back in the Everyone group. And then finally, going on down, on a Windows XP box or Windows 7 box, your security model, if we're in a work group, by default, you do not see the security tab on the machine unless you come in and change this to classic local users authenticators themselves. What used to be is, in Windows XP, if you log onto a box in a work group that was not a member of the domain, all users were treated as guests. That's why you can never ever see the security tab. So if you want to see the security tab and you set in the local policy, this is where you would set it. And then finally, everybody's favorite. All this stuff down here at the bottom. Right? All of this down here. Everybody's favorite. I'm going to say a bad word. Right? So if you don't want to hear a bad word, go la 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 la. Here's the bad word. 3, 2, 1. UAC. User Account Control. That's that box that Microsoft introduced in Vista. That when you sat down at the machine, every time you attempted to do something, a box would pop up and say, are you sure? And you have to hit yes. That's being provided by User Account Control. When you log on to a computer, even though you may be logged on with as an administrator, as a member of the administrators group, the computer treats you as a standard user. And what has to happen is every time you attempt to do something that requires elevated privileges, you're going to be prompted with, are you sure? Right? Hence those bad words, UAC. This is where I can control UAC. Specifically, right, if I want to turn UAC off, which is not a recommended thing, is right here, the bottom line item says, right, user account control, run all administrators in admin approval mode. Now if I click on that, right, this is where we're going and where it's disabled. If I want to enable that, that's where we're going to get tagged with, right, UAC. And there's behavior in here about what do you want standard users? Do you want them to be automatically denied? Do you want them to be prompted for credentials? Do you want to prompt them with credentials to the secure desktop, by the way? Secure desktop, I'm sure every one of you seen that and didn't realize what it was. The secure desktop's when the entire desktop goes dim on you and the box pops out nice and bright. That's a secure desktop. Microsoft did that for a reason. And you think to yourself, why? If I'm in a multiple monitor environment, that UAC box may be popping up on a monitor that I'm not currently focused on. So now something happens and nothing's happening. I click the button and nothing's happening. So I click the button again and nothing happens. I click it again, nothing happens. Stupid Microsoft. Stupid Windows. Stupid operating system. And the whole time over in this monitor you're not paying attention to is a box that says, are you sure? So by entering this thing, what's called the secure desktop, all monitors dim, and as soon as the monitor goes dim, it tells you you need to go find where on which monitor is that little box. The other issue used to happen is sometimes the box would pop up behind another window that was open. So we had no idea the box was there until we looked at our start menu, and down here there'd be this little flashing shield flashing at us, and you wouldn't see it on your desktop. So that's where you go down and configure UAC. So that's all the settings under security options. Moving on down, restricted groups. What restricted groups allows us to do is, let's say for instance, I have a OU that have a bunch of servers on it, and in this OU, or even local machines, let's say in this OU, this is my Phoenix Design OU, and we have a group of users called Phoenix Design Admins, and I want the Phoenix Design Admins to be members of the local administrators group on every machine in this OU, and there's 2,000 of them. On the restricted groups, I could come in here and I can actually create using the administrators group. So I just found the administrators group, and then I do an OK. Then I can come into here and I could add, I believe I just called my group IT admins earlier. Now when I hit OK, I just added the IT admins global group from the domain to the local administrators group on every single machine in this OU. But I also did something else bad. Notice, who's in this group? Only them. I just purged the group. Anyone else that's in this group just got purged out. So if I want the domain admins to stay in there or any other group to put in there, I got to make sure I add them, because if I don't add them, they're going to be purged. Coming on down, I can control every service on every machine. I can set its automatic manual disabled, its startup type. I can also control what credentials are used to log on or start the service. The downside here is if I set a service in a group policy, I can't change the service out of the machine. Let's say I go in here and I set it to manual, or I set it to disabled, and I get out to the machine and realize it should have been automatic. I can't change it to the machine. Coming on down, file systems. Right, down here, what this allows me to do is, let's say I have a folder out on every machine, and let's call this folder, I'm going to create a new folder. Let's say this folder exists. I'm going to call it data. What I can do with this folder is on every machine that's in the OU where this group policy is linked, I can set the NTFS missions on that data folder without having to go touch the machine. So I can actually set default permissions on the folder when it was created. Now come here and set the NTFS permissions. My Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. Microsoft introduced this with Vista. And what the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security allows me to do is not only can I create inbound rules that we used to create in Windows XP and Windows 2003, I can now create inbound and outbound rules. And not only can I create inbound and outbound rules, I can also create rules that are, I'm just going to create a dummy rule real quick. Program, I'm going to do all programs. I'm going to make it allow this connection. But notice, I can also choose what type of firewall profile they're on. Starting in Vista, Microsoft introduced firewall profiles. You're only in a domain profile if the computer is a member of the domain and we're in the network segment where a domain controller can be seen. If the domain controller cannot be seen, right, the computer will not allow me to choose a domain profile. It's 100% automatic. Private and public. Every time your Windows Vista or later computer connects to a network, a box pops up and asks you, are you public? Are you at work? Are you at home? If you choose public, it's going to put you into the public profile. If you are at home or you're at work and it's not a domain, it'll put you in the private profile. Now, what does this do? As an administrator, I can set up different hardware profiles or firewall profiles based off of where the computer is located to either allow or disallow unsolicited inbound communications. So I can do it as an inbound rule. Oops. I can also do it as an outbound rule. The other thing that Microsoft has done is in Windows XP, Windows 2000, Windows 2003, and Windows 2000, your IPsec rules were set down here in this thing called IPsec policies, where they were set. Starting with Vista and later operating systems, our IPsec rules are now configured under connection security rules. They moved IPsec to the firewall. So if you turn the firewall off, you turn off IPsec. You turn on the firewall, it turns IPsec back on if you've enabled it. And the last thing I can do here is, under the actual firewall itself properties, this is where I can control whether the firewall is on or off for both the domain, the private, the public, and set up the IPsec rules. Moving on down, coming down here to policies. This is where I can configure automatic enrollment for certificates. It's also where I can designate your designated recovery agent for encryption. This is also where I can turn off the file encryption service, or EFS, throughout the entire organization. Microsoft has recently made a recommendation is if you don't need EFS, EFS should be turned off. And that pretty much covers the major line items in the security settings, with one exception. The differences between software restriction policies and AppLocker. Software restriction policies are configured here. Application policies are configured here. So let's discuss a few minutes what these are before we actually show you the configurations. A software restriction policy is used in anything running Windows 2003 or later. Any operating system running Windows 2003 or later, it allows me to go in and create a rule of whether I'm going to allow or disallow you to run a specific application or a specific group of applications. I can allow or disallow those applications to run based off of, and some of these are the same between AppLocker and SR, and the SRP is, I can base it off of a MD5 hash. When I install the application, it creates a hash for the application's installation, and then as a result, I either can allow or disallow the application run based off the hash. In AppLocker or in SRP, hash rules were used to be considered one of the most secure mechanisms for creating the rule. I then can create a rule based off of certificate in SRP. So I can go out and I can choose a publisher and based off their certificates. Notice over here in AppLocker, they're called a publisher. So I can base it off a certificate. So I either can allow or disallow applications all to run based off of a certificate from a vendor. I can get very, very specific for a specific application. I can make it broader, for instance, a Microsoft Office, cover all Office products, or I can even go broader and say all Microsoft products, either allow or disallow. I can create a path rule, and again, they both have the path rule. This path could be within the directory structure, or the path could be inside of the registry. The path rule on both of these is the easiest to configure. It's also the easiest to compromise. I create it based off a path. I move the file to a different path, right? And if it was blocked based on the path, it now runs. And then a rule that we had under SRP that we don't have under AppLocker is I could either allow or disallow applications to run based off of where they were installed off the internet. So software restrictions or software restriction policies were not as robust, I'm going to say, as AppLocker was, right? But it can also control all operating systems that are Microsoft based. To create a software restriction rule, I come here under software restrictions, right click, create a new rule. And then if I come in here, notice under the enforcement, right? This is where I can enforce the DLLs, whether or not I can enforce against everyone but administrators, right? Enforce it based off certificate rules. If I come up to the actual security levels themselves, this is where it states the rules themselves. Unrestricted, right? Allows the users to determine access by user rights. Basic always runs the application as long as it doesn't require administrative rights, and disallow blocks it. If I click on the additional rules, this is where I actually will see the rules that are created by default. And what Microsoft has done is basically any application that's in the Windows directory or any application that's in the program files directory will be able to run unrestricted. So anyone will be able to run them. Be very, very careful if you configure this in a Windows 2003 environment. In Windows 2003, instead of setting this to unrestricted, it was set to restricted. So if you created a software restriction rule in Windows 2003 and you didn't come change this, you just stopped all applications from running, and things, including things like Calculator and WordPad and Notepad, all stopped running. So if I wanted to create a rule for a specific application, right click, and this is where I create my rules: certificate rule, hash rule, internet or path rule. So that's where I configure software restrictions. Again, the nice thing about software restrictions is, right, the software restriction policy will cover any Microsoft operating system running Windows 2000 or later, including Windows 7 and Vista and Windows 8, 2008, 2008 R2, and 2012. It covers them all. So now you're asking yourself, then Rick, why am I even concerned about these AppLocker rules? Well, first of all, AppLocker will only apply to Windows 7 Enterprise and Ultimate, Windows 8 Enterprise, Server 2008 R2, and Server 2012. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, what if I got Windows XP boxes in my environment? Or I'm running Windows 7 Professional? Sorry, you're going to be stuck with software restrictions. AppLocker only runs on those operating systems, only those operating systems. But what's the advantage of running AppLocker instead of software restrictions? Notice when I created the software restrictions rule, it included everybody that's in that OU. Right? If I create an application locker rule, first of all, I have now application rules, and I have this brand new thing down here. If you've actually looked in here before, all of a sudden you see this thing here you've never seen before. Packaged app rule. That's new. That will only support Windows 8 Enterprise and Server 2012. What packaged application rules do is it allows me to create a rule based off an entire software package, not just an individual component of a package. One of the problems we used to have for applications written for pre-Windows 8 was you may get this application on a software package from a vendor that may have 4, 5, 6 different pieces of software in it. And when you install it, those 6 pieces of software might actually be digitally signed by different organizations because they were just packaged together by company A, but they were made by company B, C, and D. Whereas a package designed for Windows 8. When they're packaged together, in order to be considered a package, they all have to be created by and signed by Company A. They can't be any third-party signatures in there. So now I can create rules based off the entire package, not just individual applications in the package. So if I come down here to this executable rule, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to exit out of the Group Policy Management console, and I'm going to bring up a local policy. And I'm going to be doing this on my domain controller. But I'm going to edit the local policy. That way I don't have to wait for group policy to kick in for me. So I'm going to do the local policy on this box. And notice when I expand the local policy, it looks just like the domain policy did. Come down here to security policies, come down here to my application control policies, come down to App Locker. Right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click on execution rules, and I'm going to create a new rule. I'm going to hit next. Now, what's nice about the App Locker is A, it's wizard driven, and B, instead of focusing on everybody in the OU, right, I now can tell it specific users and computers, or let me rephrase that, specific users or group of users I want this to affect. The user doesn't have to be in this OU. Do you guys hear that? The user doesn't have to be in this OU. This now supports the computers being in a computer's OU, the users being in a user's OU, and now the settings can affect a user that's not even in this OU. So I can come in, I'm going to say I'm going to do a deny. And if I did a select, and if I were doing this as an actual group policy object, when I did an advance, I do a find now, this actually will show me all the groups that are in my domain and all my users. Well, I don't want to focus this on an individual right now, so I'm going to say everyone, deny, because I want it to catch me also as the domain admin. I'm going to hit next. Notice I now have a hash rule, a path rule, or a publisher rule. I'm going to choose the publisher rule. Next. Now I have to go find the certificate. So I'm going to browse, and in this instance here, I want to block the users from being able to run Excel, right? I want to block Excel. So I come down here in Microsoft Office, right? Office 14. Oops. Went under the wrong window. Okay. Office 14, and I'm going to come down, I'm going to find Excel. Right? Now here under Excel, right, I have the file version. This is only going to block the 2010 version of Excel. If a user attempted to run an earlier version of Excel, it would be allowed. If a user was attempting to run a later version of Excel, it would be allowed. But if I do this, I can choose this version and above, this version and below, or if I want all versions of Excel to be blocked, I just move my scroll bar up one. Now all versions of Excel get blocked. If I want to block everything from Microsoft Office, I move this up here. And you're saying to myself, wait a minute, why is Office even on the machine if you're going to block all the Office products? Well, what if you want to block all the Office products but Word? I can choose here, block all Microsoft Office products, hit next, and then on this screen over here, I can actually come in and create an exception for just Word. So now all Microsoft Office products are blocked but Word. If I want to block every piece of software from a given publisher, in this case I would be blocking all Microsoft products. So let's say you want to block something from a specific publisher. Or this one here blocks it from all publishers. And again, when I hit next, I can create an exceptions list. So for this demo here, I'm only going to block Excel. Next. No exceptions. Next. And notice the user-friendly name it gives up here. It's actually the entire path to the product. So I'm going to say block Excel. And then I'm going to create the package. And now I'm going to hit no. Right? I just created a App Locker rule that's going to block Excel. but we have a problem. I just basically shot myself in the foot. Think about it for a minute. Remember, implicit denies. What does an implicit deny do? If I don't give you permissions to do something, it's implied you don't get permissions. Based off of the rule I just created, who have I given permissions to? And you're saying to yourself, and you're all going, nobody. You're 100% correct. I explicitly blocked Excel, but I gave no permissions for any other piece of software to run. So right now, once AppLocker kicks in, right, users in this OU, if this were an OU-based policy, or in this case for this computer, right, users would not be able to run any applications. So you're thinking to yourself, well, that's pretty useless. Well, it is kinda. But remember at the very end there, I clicked that no instead of yes? What that no did is it asked me if I wanted to create the default rules. And if I would have said yes, it would have created these 3 rules. The first rule allows anyone in the Everyone's group to run any program in the Program Files folder. It allows anyone or everyone to run any application in the Windows folder. It allows any administrator to run anything on the machine. What's cool about this is a user downloads something like Yahoo Messenger that gets stored in their user profile. Well, the user profile is no longer in the Windows directory or the Program Files directory. They won't be able to run that Google Messenger because it's not in the appropriate path. Now you think to yourself, well, that's not so bad. Well, folks, guess what? I still don't have a policy that's doing anything. Excel will still run. If I actually want to do anything now, I have to go back to the AppLocker here, and I have to come down here where it says Configure Rule Enforcement. And then I select Configure. Now when I configure the enforcement, I have 2 options. Enforce the rule or audit the rule. If all I do is audit the rule, right, it will let me know that, right, people are running this application when they launch it and they close it, or when people are attempting to run, in this case, Excel. They'll still be able to run it. I'll just get a report that they actually ran it. If I enforce the rule, it actually enforces the rule. I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to hit OK. Folks, I'm still not blocking the application. There's still one more step. So I have to bring up services. There's a new service that Microsoft introduced in Windows 7 called the Application Identity Service. This is the service that is used to determine the identity of the application for the purposes of AppLocker. So I have to start it. Now, what I normally do is I leave it in manual. I start it. And the reason why I leave it in manual, if by chance I forgot to create those default rules and I can't start anything, or I blocked the wrong application and I can't do what I need to do, if I restart the machine, the identity service isn't running. And because the identity service isn't running, AppLocker isn't running. Until I'm positive I got it worked out exactly the way I want it, and then I can set it to start. And again, because it's a service, I can start this service on all the machines inside my network using group policy. Now that I've got the service running, my next step would be to run a GP update. So it updates the policy. For whatever reason, right, even after I update the policy, and I've started the service, and I've enforced it, it still takes about 6 to 8 minutes before the group policy and AppLocker picks up that I'm blocking Excel. So I can still run Excel. Right now I can still run it. It's going to take 6 or 8 minutes before it picks up that I shouldn't be able to run it. So while it's picking that up, right, let me show you where the logs are for AppLocker. So if I bring up my event viewer, Microsoft created a new event viewer starting with Vista also. What we have is under Applications and Services logs, we have the Microsoft logs, We have the Windows logs. Then underneath the Windows logs, we have all these additional logs. And if I come down, there's a log here called AppLocker. And when I click on that, here's all the different operational logs. And specifically for this demo, I blocked Excel or executables and DLLs. So if I were to come over here and double click on this, this will show me that AppLocker was enabled, was successfully applied to this computer. What's interesting is this log exists on Windows 7 professional boxes. And if you think that you are pushing out AppLocker and you go to your Windows 7 box and it's not, if you come to your Windows 7 box, it'll actually have a line item that'll say AppLocker in the log. And what it will say right here is the AppLocker was not successfully started this computer. And then it'll say does not meet minimum system requirements, because you have to have a minimum of Windows 7 Enterprise or Ultimate in order for AppLocker to work. And you'll see the same log if you were on a Windows 8 Professional box or Windows 8 Ultimate instead of Windows 8 Enterprise. So I've been flapping my jaw here for a few minutes, showing you that. Let's see if by chance that AppLocker rule is kicked in yet. Right. Come on. Oops, let me close this up. Maybe EXCEL. And I should be getting a prompt right here in the middle of the screen if Excel doesn't launch that says application has been blocked by the administrative group. Come on. Looks like it's blocking it. Let's go look at our event viewer. Application services logs, Microsoft, Windows, AppLocker. And notice actually it did. We no longer get the alert. It just came out and said, notice it was allowed to run the MMC, right? Was prevented from running. Was prevented from running. So AppLocker actually stopped Excel from running. We just never saw on the server popping up. I know on Windows 8 and on Windows 7, the box still pops up that says the application was blocked by the administrators. So now if this is exactly what I wanted, I can now deploy this policy out to the network. If this is not what I wanted, we could go back into my services. And in services, if I stop the application identity service, again, this would take 6 or 8 minutes to stop, but once I stop the application identity service, and it takes 6 or 8 minutes to stop it, Excel will run again. Excel will run. So what did we look at in this session? We looked at the security options that are now configurable through a group policy object to computers within an OU or those settings that are only configurable at the domain. We looked at password policy, auditing policy. We looked at some user rights settings. We looked at some security settings and privilege settings. We also then looked at the Windows Firewall with advanced security settings, software restrictions, and AppLocker.